1 Corinthians chapter 8, and we're actually going to try and cover chapter 8 and chapter 9, which I think is probably the first time I have ever attempted 2 chapters in one. But chapter 8 is only 13 verses, so we won't cover a grand amount of space in verse-wise, but it will be 2 chapters. But the reason I want to tonight is in chapter 8, Paul is talking about meat being sacrificed to idols on the surface. And if you take a sermon, and I often have, in fact, I've used this passage before, if you take just a sermon or a short Bible study, chapter by chapter, you actually miss the tenor, the undercurrent of what Paul is actually talking about. And he answers those questions actually from chapter 8 to chapter 10, but there's no way to cover 3 chapters tonight. So we're just going to cover the 2. Before we begin, I actually would like to explain what he's going to be talking about. Back in their day, when people would come to bring sacrifices to whatever given god they wanted to worship, whether it was of Judaism or Greek, the pantheon of gods, or Roman, they would bring their food to that temple, whatever it might be. And what would happen is, after the ceremony, after the food has been sacrificed to the god in question, they would cut the meat up, and the person bringing it would take some of it back for his family, and they would eat with it. The other part would be taken, and that was all the priests. And the priest would take what he needed for his family, or she, depending on priestess, and then whatever was left over, they would take it to the marketplace. And then they would sell it at the marketplace. Now, because it's a gift to a deity, it was always the best cuts of meat that they had. But because it was already been used, it was on clearance. So you could get the best best cut of meat for the cheapest prices in the marketplace. And so that's how they did it, especially in Corinth. The problem was, as we've mentioned many times, the church at Corinth had many problems. And they were people that were coming out of paganism, trying to follow the Lord, and they had been some of those people to take the gifts to their pantheon of gods. And they had been the ones to buy in the marketplace this meat that had been sacrificed to these gods. Well, now you get saved, and you're not wanting to worship any of those other gods. You've got one God now. So you don't want to be eating that meat that's already been in worship and doing pagan, awful, terrible things somewhere else. So it created a problem. Can you imagine if you felt bad about eating the meat that was sacrificed to idols, every time you'd show up to a friend's house to eat meal, and man, they pull out the filet mignon right in front of you, you know? The first question is, okay, where did he get it? Should I eat it? What should I do with it? Do I refuse it and then hurt the relationship between the person that I'm trying to commune with? Do I eat it and just not worry about it? Do I eat it and it's sinful and I have to go ask God to forgive me? What do we do with that? And so the church wrote in this letter that they wrote to Paul, this is one of their questions. What do we do with this? It's a major problem. There's some that are saying, just eat it, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then there's some that say, no, you can't eat it, and if you do, it's damnation. What do we do, Paul? So he's going to take the next 2 chapters, 3, 8, 9, and 10, to deal with the response. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about eating food, and particularly meat sacrificed to idols. So let's start with chapter 8, verse 1. He says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone thinks he really knows something, he has not yet learned it as he ought to know it. But if anyone loves, God is known by him. The problem that arose was that people had this high knowledge, and they were looking down on everybody else around them. Now, the truth is, their high knowledge was actually more scriptural than the other people, but how they were applying it was wrong. Paul makes a distinction here in verse 1 that I don't know how many times I've read through this. I've preached from it. I've talked past it. I never caught this. Notice, he said, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Gaining knowledge is not a bad thing, but it is a dangerous thing because it can make you arrogant, and that's what was happening. Paul says, instead of knowledge, it's more important to have love, because knowledge will puff you up, but love builds you up. It's the difference in a person's visual mind. If you were going to paint a picture, knowledge would be blowing up a balloon. A balloon can get really big, but it doesn't take much to puncture it, and then there's a problem. But if you go to build a skyscraper, you're not going to pump it with a bunch of air. You're going to build it brick by brick, steel by steel, and it's stronger. What Paul is making the distinction here is, you have the right knowledge, but you don't know how to apply it, and it's made you arrogant. Verse 4. Now concerning eating food offered to idols, we know that no idol is real in this world, and that there is only one God. For even if there are gods, lowercase g, in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many so-called gods and lords, both lowercase, yet for us there is only one God, the Father, from whom everything came into being and for whom we live. And there is only one Lord, Jesus the Messiah, through whom everything came into being and through whom we live. Paul says, it's true. You go to offer up idols to idols. These idols are nothing. They're pieces of stone and wood. They're carved, but they don't mean anything. They're representative of an empty power. There's only one God that's powerful over all. That's the one we worship. But notice he does make mention, though, there are lowercase g and lowercase l gods and lords in the heavenly realms. In other places, they're named principalities and powers. These are ranks, and if you want more on that study, I would strongly advise you to look up Dr. Michael Heiser in his book, The Unseen Realm, and then there's also, he does Bible studies on it. You can find those even on YouTube. But the point that he's trying to make is, when you go to offer this food before a being, you're offering it before a piece of dead wood and a piece of dead stone or metal. It's not going to do anything. It's pointless. Verse 7. But not everyone has this knowledge. Everybody doesn't get it that way. Some people are so accustomed to idolatry that when they eat food that has been offered to an idol, their conscience becomes contaminated because it is weak. However, food will not bring us closer to God. Technically, it would. If you eat enough of it, you shorten your lifespan. It could make you. I digress. It doesn't make you any closer to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat food that has been offered to an idol, and no better off if we do. These idols aren't God. They're empty of power. They're devoid of any being. They can't help you or hinder you if you eat the food. In fact, it's not just the idols, but the food itself. They had this weird belief that there were demons everywhere that were trying to invade, and one of the places that they tried to invade was in your food. And so the Jews came up with this crazy pattern of washing their hands, where they would take the water and they would pour it down this hand, and then they would go the other way and they'd let the water pour down this hand so that everything would wash off. They'd be completely clean. There's no demons that could get you. Have to be the food, right? No. In fact, God even told Peter what? In the dream, brought down the big curtain. What did he say? Don't call unclean what I call clean. You have free reign to eat anything. The food's not the problems. The idols aren't the problems. But not everyone walks on that level of spiritual walk. For some, doing it would lead them back to the old life in which they once lived. And this brings up the discussion of gray areas and personal convictions. And this place is actually more dangerous to preach on and to teach on than what I talked about last week on sex. Because people hold these things like a dog with a bone. Their personal convictions, their gray areas, they make them more important than anything else. And so when you go to speak on them, people don't like it. There are things that are black and white. Right and wrong. Right and left, I gotta get it right. There are things that are black and white. There's things that we cannot deny as Christians. The Trinity, Jesus being God and completely man, Jesus, that he died and he was resurrected on the third day, that our salvation comes by faith, forgiveness of sins, the infilling of the Spirit, heaven and hell, our resurrection from the dead, and there's others that you can go to that we as Christians have to believe on. But besides those foundational beliefs, there's a whole lot of interpretation that varies dramatically in our walk. So here's a few examples. Doctrinal issues of the denomination, what your denomination believes or whatever. It could be as far as God ordained you to be saved from the foundations of the world. You had no choice in the matter, and either it doesn't matter how you lived, you're picked way back then, and you made it all the way through. Or, like we believe in God's free choice, that we have the choice. The gift has been given, and we choose whether to walk or not. Or, how about this one? What day to worship on? We often, we just take it for granted in the Nazarene church that it's Sunday, but that's actually a little more wishy-washy than we'd like to think. Because God ordained the seventh day, Saturday, the Sabbath, all the way back in Genesis, chapter 1. How about this one? How often should we worship? I think across most denominations, getting them to show up once a week is pretty difficult, much less 3 times a week, and sometimes it's only 2 times a year, Christmas and Easter. How often should we worship? Hear about personal ones. Can Christians drink alcohol? Can Christians use tobacco? Can Christians go to the movies? Should Christian women only wear dresses? How about wearing jewelry or the politics that you follow? All of these are important. I'm not denying that. I'm not trying to lower those problems. But my point is, these are all interpretation and gray issues. And they are not to be held to the same standard as the black and white ones of our salvation being by faith, that Jesus was God and man, that he died and rose again. These other ideas are not as important. And it gets really wishy-washy. We all have our reasons for why we have them. And 95% of them, we've got scriptures to back up our beliefs. My goal isn't to dissuade us from having these gray issues. We all have them. We all have our personal convictions. But my goal is to realign our thinking to make sure that what we are holding as gray areas we're not holding them to the same standard as the black and white ones. Because the problem is, we often hold these convictions of ours so tightly and so strongly that they're more important than all the big foundational issues, and they also become more important to the people around us, including the lost. I remember my dad telling a story of a Christian camp up in Michigan where he attended. And it was back in the 70s. Maybe it was the 60s. I can't remember which. It was in between the 60s and 70s. But it was back when the mini skirts were really mini, and they were a very conservative camp. And this lady walks up with her kid, and the kid sees all the kids playing, and they're all excited. She doesn't know anything. She's a sinner. She doesn't know how you're supposed to act or whatever. And her kid's all excited, and they're going to bring him to camp. And one of the ladies catches her before she even makes it over there and says, "You get off this campus right now. You do not belong here. You should never dress like this." And the kid's head hung, and the mother's head hung, and they never came back. When we hold our standards too high, our convictions, they can be held more important than the person. What would have happened when they brought the lady caught in adultery naked before Jesus? His opinion mattered. Theirs didn't. And he didn't say, "Hey, go get some clothes on." No, he said, "Go and sin no more. I don't condemn you." Most churches have made their gray areas, their personal opinions, these convictions, more important than the people that they're trying to minister to. Gray areas are not to be held to the same standard of the foundational black and white. And I have this picture. My goal is to remind you of Matthew chapter 7 in Jesus' parable in his Sermon on the Mount, of the man that builds his house on the rock and the man that builds his house on the sand. God's foundation, the black and white issues, are the rock. But as we start building our house on convictions and gray areas, the house becomes a lot more unstable. And when the storms come, we're usually left with rubble. And we can't do that. If you want to join a group of believers that agree with your personal gray areas and convictions, that's fine. I'm not putting down gray areas or convictions at all. But don't make your convictions the same level of importance as salvation. Unfortunately, myself included, we have argued over these issues to the point so vehemently that we've broken off fellowship and communion and unity with other believers. And God's not happy with that. I'm not saying we all just come into big one and we all agree, and I'm not saying that. But I am saying on these other issues, the gray areas, if we can't agree, okay, well, then we can't argue either to keep unity. And we need to keep unity. Some people believe something about the scripture, or maybe even they have felt that God told them that this was to be a conviction of theirs as a boundary for their life. I'll give this example because she'll probably watch later on and we talk, and she actually, I think the last time we talked about this. My grandmother wasn't saved until she was well into adulthood. And she also grew up she was an adult during the 50s and the 60s. And when she got saved, God told her, "You're not going to dress like you once did in your old life." And so from then on, she wore dresses and she wore skirts. And she always dressed modestly because she wasn't going to go back to that old life. That's what God called her to. That's a good thing. For me personally, and I know I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again because it needs to be heard. I don't stay up past 2 a.m. And I certainly don't do it on the internet because that's a danger spot for me. I don't want to go back to the life that I once lived. And so there's a standard in my life that I have set that I don't cross that boundary. Now, the exception of like Friday when I go to cook with Matt all night long for his family reunion the next day, I'll be up all night long. But I'm going to be with somebody. My point is, gray areas and convictions are not a bad thing. They are a good thing for our own personal lives, but they are not to be held to the same standard as everybody else. Because I have a problem staying up past 2 a.m. and keeping my mind straight, does that mean everybody has to go to bed at 1:59? No. People working second and third shift that all go to hell, right? Doesn't work that way. My convictions are my convictions. Would I encourage you to maybe follow after my conviction if it's been a blessing to you? Sure. But should I convince you that because God told me this for my life that it should be yours? Absolutely not. That's between you and the Lord. There's some times when personal convictions are good and wonderful, and they can prevent everyone from a lot of trouble. But that doesn't mean that it's law for everybody. All right. Often the danger when we're talking about convictions and gray areas is that we push our ideas, on someone else. Paul here is actually doing it in the opposite. He's doing it in the reverse. Notice what he said. Go back to the previous verses there, Daniel. Notice how he presents it. He's actually talking not about the people that are pushing their convictions on someone else, but these people were pushing their liberty, that I can do whatever I want, on somebody else. He even tells us something that we don't really get in our day and age, especially in our denomination. We get the idea that the people that are straight-laced, rigid, they live by standards that most of us might not even attempt because they're so strict. Those people are the holy ones. They're the ones that are closest to God. Paul doesn't say that here. He says the people that are setting up all these regulations, they're actually the weak Christians. See it? Verse 10, for if anyone with a weak conscience sees you. The idea here is, it's not about all the things you set up in your life. It's not it. It's about understanding the liberty that Christ has given you and using it for his kingdom. And there's two totally different thoughts there. Paul says that the strong are those that have realized the liberty where Christ has made them free, and now he's encouraging them that their liberty should advance God's kingdom. So let's go to it. Verse 9. But you must see to it that this right of yours does not become a stumbling block for those who are weak. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you, who know better, eating in an idol's temple, he will be encouraged to eat what has been offered to idols, won't he? So what he's saying is, if you go out in your liberty, you know that just eating this meat doesn't mean anything. It's just as good as anything else at the market. If you go on and eat it, and somebody else sees you eating it, and they're offended by it because they're weaker, you're the one in the wrong. Kind of like what we talked about last week. Don't I have the right to do with my body what I choose? Paul says no again. You're responsible for your actions inside the fellowship. And if you're bringing other people to fall and stumble, it's a bad place for you to be. What Paul is telling them is, even though you are in the right by eating this food how you see fit, if you are a stumbling block to others, you're no longer in the right. You were bought with a high price. You no longer own yourself. Now you're living to look out for your fellow brothers and sisters more than your own wants. As a Christian, as a part of the body of believers, it is our focus, or should be our focus, to care more about our fellow brothers and sisters in need than our own desires and our wants. And that is church on a whole nother level. The majority of people in the church don't even do that with God. They don't even live that way before their Maker. Let me explain. Go throughout life, we get our salary, we provide our needs, we provide our wants, what we want out of life, and then when we come to church, we're like, all right, God, I'll give you some of the leftover, if not all of it. I've got my wants, I've got my desires, good enough. What Paul is saying here is, oh no, folks, if you're a Christian, it's not just for God. You take care of your needs, sure. But before you take care of your wants and your desires, you look to the need of your fellow brothers and sisters, the weak in the church, and you fulfill their needs before you get your desires. That's what he's saying. They said, hey, we can live any way we want. We can do whatever we want. We can eat this meat. Paul says, no, you can't if it's going to be a stumbling block to your other believers. I don't care what you want. You don't get to do it. Verse 11. In this case, the weak brother for whom the Messiah died is ruined by your knowledge. They see you doing this, and then they see you doing this, and it's against their conscience, even though their conscience is weak. You've now ruined their soul. Look what he says in verse 12. This is huge. When you sin against your brothers in this way, using your liberty and being a stumbling block, and wound their weak consciences, you are sinning against the Messiah. He doesn't say you're just making problems inside the church. He says, oh no, you're sinning against Jesus. If you are a stumbling block, you're sinning against Jesus. Now, Paul knew this better than anybody else. On the road to Damascus, what did Jesus say? Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting my church? Because he certainly was. That's not what he said. Why are you persecuting me? Jesus said, if you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it to me. David in Psalm 51, verse 4, when he was repenting for all of the sin that he had committed with Bathsheba and its cover-up, what did he say? Against you and you only have I sinned. He went, in his prayer, he went dismissed Uriah, he dismissed Bathsheba, he dismissed the nation, all of that deception. No, he went right around that and he said, God, it was you and you only that I sinned against. When we are a stumbling block to our believers, even when we are in the right, we're sinning against Jesus. That's a dangerous place to be. Verse 13. Therefore, so because of verse 12, sinning against the Messiah, because of this, if food that I eat, Paul says, causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again in order to keep my brother from stumbling. The wording is very strong here. It even goes as far as to say, essentially, as long as the world is spinning, I will not eat meat if it would cause my brother to stumble. He says, I don't just say it. I'm not just going to preach it. I'm not just going to teach it. I'm going to live it. If I'm going to do something, even if I'm in the right, even if it's okay for me, if I'm going to do something and it's going to be a stumbling block, I'm going to stop it here and now. By the way, do you know what the Latin word for vegetarian means? Bad hunter. It doesn't really, I'm joking. Paul isn't discouraging or encouraging being a vegetarian, okay? That's not his point. His point is a whole other issue. It's not about eating the meat that's been sacrificed to idols. It's not about your sexual orientation or what you're doing with it, like he talked about last week. It's not about the divisions you have, and if you're following Paul and Apollos and Peter, that's not the issues that we're having here. The problem that the church at Corinth is having is the issue of love. The problem, the loss of focus, is their love that would build them together. Their arrogance has puffed them up. So now Paul is going to move into an illustration that explains this thought in chapter 9. He's letting them know that he doesn't just preach it, he doesn't just teach it, but he's actually going to live it. So he starts out with a whole list of rhetorical questions. Questions that he doesn't need the answer for because he's trying to drive a point home. And so let's go to that. chapter 9, verse 1. Am I free? Am I not? Am I an apostle? Am I not? I have seen Jesus, the Lord, our Lord, haven't I? You are the result of my work in the Lord, aren't you? Obviously, all of these answers are yes. But he's trying to drive a point home. If I'm not an apostle to other people, surely I am one to you, for you are the evidence of my apostolic authority in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. We have the right to earn our own food, don't we? We have the right to take a believing wife with us like the other apostles, like the Lord's brothers and Cephas or Peter, don't we? Or is it only Barnabas and I that have to keep on working for a living? Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes, or who takes care of a flock and does not drink of its milk. I am not saying this on my own human authority, am I? The law says the same thing, doesn't it? For the law of Moses is written, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, you must not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. God is not only concerned about the oxen, is he? Isn't he speaking for our benefit? Yes. This was written for our benefit because the one who plows should plow in hope, and the one who threshes should thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much for we to reap material benefits from you? If others enjoy this right over you, don't we have a stronger claim? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we tolerate everything in order to not put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of the Messiah. Verse 13. You know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar get their share of its offerings, don't you? That's Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 1. In the same way, the Lord has ordered those who proclaim the gospel should make their living from the gospel. So here's the point he's trying to make. He goes through all these rhetorical questions. His point is, a worker is worth his wage. If he goes to work, he deserves the pay. Whether it's being a pastor in a church, or it's a worker out in the field planting, or the one that's threshing in the harvest, they all deserve pay. And Paul says, in the same way, shouldn't I? Of all the people that should have had the right to request Corinth to pay him, it should have been Paul, because he was the one that started it. He wrote letters. He visited. He sent people back to them to teach them. He spent 1.5 years at that church when he started it. If there was anybody that should have received money from Corinth, it should have been Paul. But Paul says, verse 15, I have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this that they may be applied in my case. I would rather die than let anyone deprive me of my reason for boasting. By the way, real quick sidelight, I'm not going to harp on it. Church needs to pay its pastor. You all do. This is not on us. You all have been good to me, always have. I'm not saying that. But I have been in churches where the last thing on the menu is the pastor's salary. You know what? If you're not willing to pay the worker, God's not going to bring the harvest. And you can look across the board and you can see the boards that are stingy with their pastors, or they're going to rule their thumb over their pastors. They suffer for it because God's not going to bless that. And again, that's not here. You all do me well. I'm not saying anything against that, but verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast about, for this obligation has been entrusted to me. How terrible it would be for me if I didn't preach the gospel. I have always said this, when God gave me my call, either I'm going to be pastoring a church or somehow working in ministry to further his kingdom. And if I'm not doing that, I'm in sin. Plain and simple, till the day I die, or I can't do it anymore. That's how strongly I've always felt about my call. Well, Paul says the same thing. Woe be it from me, man. How terrible it would be for me if I didn't preach the gospel. Whether you pay me or not, he says. And don't get any ideas, board members. Oh. For if I preach voluntarily, verse 17, I get a reward. But if I am unwilling to do it, I am still entrusted with the obligation. What then is my reward? Is it to be able to preach the gospel free of charge? So I never resort to demanding my rights when I'm preaching the gospel. Paul was a tent maker. He always provided for himself as well as in ministry, so that he never had to go back to the church and say, hey, pay up. I got to have food on the table. He didn't have to do it. And in fact, he said, I would rather die than do that. Paul says, listen, this is not about the money. If anybody had the right to ask for money, it was Paul. But Paul specifically didn't do it because he wanted to make sure that the gospel wasn't hindered. The church at Corinth was split apart into divisions terribly. If Paul would have come back, it would have been a losing argument. If Paul would have come back and said, hey, y'all, I'm hurting. I need some finances. The people that were on Peter's side would have said, oh, look, he's just out for money. The people that were on Apollos' side, oh, look, he's trying to get rich off of us. They would have used it against him. And Paul was like, boys, I would rather die than see that happen. And so I don't ask for it. I have the right to, but I don't ask. Verse 19, although I am free from everyone's expectations, I have made myself a servant to all of them to win more people. To the Jews, and now he's going to give another illustration. To the Jews I became like a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like a man under the law, in order to win those under the law, although I myself am not under the law. In other words, for those that put themselves underneath the law, he said, well, I went underneath that law too. I put extra borders on myself so that I might win them. He's going back to that same issue of eating the meat. Hey, if your brother says, I can't eat this meat, I got to be under here, Paul says, well, then I'd go under there and not eat the meat with him so that I could win him. To those, verse 21, who do not have the law, I became like a man who does not have the law in order to win those who do not have the law. However, I am not free from God's law, but I'm subject to the Messiah's law. And he's referring to Old Testament, New Testament. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some of them. Paul didn't change himself for the group that he was in to become a people pleaser. But he put regulations on himself so that he might fit in, so that he would not be a stumbling block to those that he was trying to minister to. He's trying to set up an area where he himself is not seen as selfish and oppressive to those he's trying to minister to. If we only had this heart, that we would be willing to look at somebody else's life and say, you know what? They can't do that, so I'm not going to do it either, so that I can win them. Can you imagine what our world would look like if the church could just flat out do that next Sunday? I'm not saying our church isn't there, because I think in a lot of places we actually are. But the missions of the church would drastically change if we lived that kind of lifestyle. If we put ourselves to that pattern. Am I making sense? Am I coming clear? Verse 23. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, in order to share in its blessings. You know that in a race all the runners run, but only one wins the prize, don't you? You must run in such a way that you may be victorious. Greg, you might like this, and you probably already heard it, but I heard a story about Dale Earnhardt after a race, and he was being interviewed, and he came in second place. And they were asking, well, how does it feel to be in second place? And he says, it's awful. He says, it's miserable. I was the first one to lose. puts a refocus on the determination he had to win the race. In the race that we're talking about, there's no second, third, fourth place. This is either you win or you lose. We need to have the same determination that Dale Earnhardt did to win the race and cut off everything that would slow us down, everything that would wear us out before making it to the finish line. I've told you before, verse 27 scares me to death. Everyone who enters an athletic contest practices self-control in everything. They do it to win a wreath that withers away, but we run to win a prize that never fades. That is the way I run, with a clear goal in mind. That is the way I fight, not like someone that's shadowboxing. No, I keep on disciplining my body, making it to serve me, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not somehow be disqualified. Tried to do the New King James on that one. I'm not worried about getting second and third place. I don't have to beat you out in this race. I have to beat me in this race. I have to beat my flesh, my earthly desires. Because if I don't, I'm not making it to the finish line. I won't have the energy. I will have been weighed down way too much, and I'll end up being disqualified. And I tell you what, if Paul, of all people, said this, if he was worried about in his life not finishing the race, how much more me? That scares me to death. That I would go so far and then just blow it. To get within reach, and then all of a sudden the people next to me, their clothes just fall to the ground, and I realize that I missed that trumpet blast. Or I get up before God the Father, and you did really well, Dan. You were really close, but you didn't give this up in your life. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want anything to slow me down, to hold me back, or to hold me down. I want to be like the old Westerns. I want to be one of those guys that dies with my boots on. I want to die with a spud in my hand. Spud bar. My paternal grandfather, I know I've told you this story, but I want to tell you again. He's had so many heart attacks, the doctor told him, you have one more, it's over. Well, that didn't change my granddad's lifestyle any. Despite how much my grandmother said, Bud, you got to slow down. In the middle of Michigan winter, they're in church. I believe it was either Sunday night or Wednesday night. I think it was Sunday night. And there was ice out on the steps. And so he took a spud bar and he was out there busting up the ice so that the little old ladies didn't slip and fall at church. Of course, he was older than them by a good 5 or 6 years, you know. And while he was breaking up that spud bar, he had a heart attack and the Lord called him home. You know what? That's how I want to go. You know, Jesus mentioned several times when he's talking about the end times, be ready because you don't know when the hour is coming. Somebody's going to be working in the field, or two people will be working in the field. One will be gone, the other will be left working. Two people will be laying in the bed. One will be there and one will be taken. And then he also gives that illustration of the talents where you got to be at work because you don't know when the master's going to return. And what happens if the master's returned and you're not working? What'll he do with them? I want to have the spud bar in my hand. I want to have the Bible in my hand. I don't want to be caught unawares and miss it by that much. In closing, Paul is trying to realign their thinking, and he will as well in chapter 10, but at least for 9 and 8. They were worried about eating this meat. And the church had lots of problems. But he's trying to realign their thinking to a higher level, to a higher calling that it didn't click in their mind. We like to break laws down, especially in spiritual terms, down to do's and don'ts. And if we read this passage really quickly, we'll just grab the idea that it's not so important about what we eat as meat. But this isn't what he's trying to tell them. He's trying to have them follow another law, a law that he follows that supersedes anything that they're asking about. When Jesus wrote the church at Ephesus, what did he say that was bad about the church at Ephesus? Do you remember? He said, man, you're doing great things. You're doing great works. But this one thing I have against you, you've done what? You've forgotten your first love. You see, the church at Corinth, they had all of these problems. They had really bad things going on. But Paul says, not these things down here. I want to take you up here. I want to lead you to something that will take you above these problems. It may take you through them, but I want to take you above them. The two greatest laws. You love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what? Your neighbor is yourself. If you fulfill those two laws, all of these others down here take care of themselves. It's not an issue about your sexuality, whether it's divorce or eating meat or divisions in the church. No, it's your lack of love for your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. If you got that fixed, if you got it where you love God and you love your neighbor, these other things will get taken care of. Verse 1 of chapter 8, he said that love builds up. It doesn't puff up. It edifies. We need to get the point in our lives where we care more about the needs of our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ than our own wants and desires. And like I said, that's church on a whole nother level. That's taking our focus off of us and what we want and God's church and what it needs. Is there anything that we're doing or that we're not doing that is worth the price of somebody else's soul? Paul says, if I have to be a vegetarian to save one soul, I'll do it. What are we doing or not doing that's worth somebody else's soul? We'd say, oh, Pastor, nothing. Nothing. I mean, the soul is ultimate value. Really? If we're being honest, we'd probably say, well, maybe their soul's valuable, but probably not more valuable than my Andy Griffith reruns. Because let's face it, there's a whole lot of church people that would rather sit and watch Andy Griffith reruns than go to church to build each other up in the faith. Ooh, does that step on toes? Probably not. I'm preaching to the choir. Y'all here on Wednesday night, right? Well, maybe we're not the choir, but we're close. You'd say, well, there's nothing else more important. Well, maybe, if we're honest, football or basketball games. Because there's a whole lot of church people that they won't even come to church on Super Bowl Sunday. They don't want to miss the basketball game. They don't want to miss the football game. It's more important to see that on TV than to come in and build somebody else up in the faith. Is there absolutely anything in our lives that is worth losing our soul or someone else's soul over? Really? God, you can have all of that, but I'm keeping this no matter what. Boy, you don't want to have that response on Judgment Day. God help us to love Him and to love others more than our own desires. You see, that's what chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10 are about. It's not an issue of divorce and marriage and sexuality and eating meat or paying the pastor. It's about how much do we love God and how much do we love others, that we are willing to make sacrifices of ourselves so that they get the help that they need. Church on a whole nother level. Let's pray.
Hi, everyone.
Our Heavenly
Thank you
Father,
so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.